just got a fair few people coming in this morning, so I'm just letting everyone in. It's 10:30, so we'll get started fairly shortly, but I'll just keep letting a few people in, and then away we go. So can everyone just show hands? I'm just going to record the session. Is that okay that I record the session so that we can send it to people that haven't been able to make it today? Yep, that's great. So my name's Olivia Meredith. I'm the Shared Services Manager for Landcare New South Wales, and very happy to be bringing Jessica Leck here today to do a transformative project management webinar for us. Jess comes with a wealth of experience across academic space, not-for-profit space, government space, and we're going to be talking through some fairly innovative ways to project manage today. And Jess is very much across the Landcare space as well, so we're very privileged in that way that she really understands the space that everyone is working in. So I'm coming to you from Guringai land today. It's very beautiful outside with lots of birdsong. And what I'll do now is just hand over to Jess and she can take it from here. So thank you, Jess.
Great. Thank you so much, Olivia. I'll just share screen. Can everyone see those slides? Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so as Olivia mentioned, I've been asked to talk to you today about project design for transformative change and grant success. Now, in order to do that, I need to lay some foundations, so that's where we'll start. But before I get started, I would like to acknowledge the country that I'm coming to you from today, being that of the Worimi people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I recognise this land always was and it always will be Worimi country, and it was stolen and never ceded. There's a bit to say about that in the current context, but I'd love for you guys to pop into the chat where you're joining from today, and also what network you're coming from, but specifically your traditional land. So there's a lot of discussion at the moment about welcome to country, and it would be remiss of me today to not mention that if we're talking about a session on transformative change, it's really important to reflect on what that means in this practice. Today, I'm going to reference a IPBES report quite a lot. And one of the key findings that they found in this report is one of the key conditions for transformative change to be applied and reach its potential is in recognising and empowering alternative knowledge systems. And if we are in a country where we are lucky enough to have one of the longest continuous knowledge systems in the world, it would be remiss of us to not recognise that and be grateful for the learnings that we can apply to our work that we all do so passionately. So who am I? As Louise said, I'm Jessica Leck. My face might be a bit familiar to you because I was an RLC for the Mid-Coast to Tops Landcare connection for 4 years. And then with the most recent LEP, I took the opportunity to make a move out to an international not-for-profit. Could I just ask that if some people put themselves on mute, there's just a bit of background noise, and I've got my own background noise of my dogs. It's a bit chaotic, but that's okay. So yeah, I took the opportunity to move to a small international not-for-profit where I now work with small communities across the Indo-Pacific region. But Landcare is really deep in my heart, specifically because I really believe for long-term transformational change to be applied, we really need that community ownership, and that's what Landcare does so well. So after leaving that role as RLC, I kept my ties with the Landcare network by offering myself in a consulting capacity. And I work with groups across New South Wales, and on all the work I do, I have this main aim, which is to build community capacity to make meaningful change, understand their value, and advocate for their landscapes. I do this by, I provide grant writing support. Now, I don't write grants for you. I help write grants and design projects in a way that makes them, more transformational and hopefully more successful, but also help increase the capacity of staff and volunteers to write future grant applications in the future. I also provide project and organisational strategic planning and provide staff and community training across grant writing, project management, community building, and basically any way that you guys see that I might be helpful for you. So today what we're going to talk about is we're going to go over what is transformative change or transformational change. Then we're going to talk about how this can be achieved through a concept called systems thinking. Then we're going to apply.
I'm happy to probably check in.
Then we're going
Tash, I guess,
to
I interact with during the week.
Sorry,
but
if
don't
everyone
actually
can
have a
just
sort
put
of a
themselves
catch-up,
on
and
mute.
so I can.
We've just got a few people not on mute. Thank you.
Sorry.
Be able
Then
to
we're going. Oh,
mute off from everybody. I think you can overrule Jess as like the host of the day. Just mute everyone.
There we go. So then I'm going to try and give you some helpful hints about how you can embed this kind of thinking into your project design and also into your grant writing. And then I suspect we will run out of time, but I will talk you through a few key practical tools that you can use to kind of map out this type of thinking. And I will provide the slides that will have the links to these tools if you want to dive deeper into any of the tools that I go over. Then we'll finish up with a Q&A. And I really want to stress to you guys that I would love it if throughout the conversation today, if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat as you think of them. I've spoken with Olivia, and if there are questions that will be really helpful to this discussion at the time, Olivia will put her hand up, interrupt me, wave her arms, and I'm happy to take questions throughout. So please drop your questions in as they come up, and we'll either address them as we go, or we'll have a rich discussion at the end. Okay, so this is kind of how I think of the common plan when we think about projects at the moment: conservation, natural resource management, land management. I think we all go into it with great intentions. Project deliverers, the people delivering the project, also the funders. Everyone's got great intentions. But then we just kind of assume some magic happens and then good things happen. Yeah. Well, for me, this approach kind of comes from a very reactionary, assumptive, and it's passion-driven place. But today I want to explore with you what can happen when we kind of delve deeper into that magic and the thinking that can go in behind it. So, what is transformative change? The IPBES report that is linked at the end, and I'll refer to quite a bit, it defines transformative change as a fundamental system-wide reorganisation across technological, economic, social factors that involves shifts in paradigms and goals and values. In other words, transformative change is about shifting a whole system, the structures, the mindsets, and the policies that cause a problem, instead of just treating the symptoms. Now, it's really important to understand that when we talk about transformative projects, the IPBES report and, globally, transformative change is defined as what is required in order to create a just and sustainable world. Now, we don't live in a just and sustainable world at this point, so transformative change hasn't happened. But what we can do is refer to projects that have transformative change potential. So that's where the examples that are scattered through today are considered to have potential if we can scale them and recognize them. Today, this kind of concept can feel really intangible, and I understand that, especially where I go, oh, I can't give you an example because there's no such thing as a just and sustainable world. I get it. It can feel really intangible, but I guess the best example that we have about what transformative change can look like was the Industrial Revolution. That was a transformative change that had rippling effects across the globe. It changed the way we live today from one single invention. Now, some of us would say that was, for good, for bad, in different places, in different ways. But it began with one single invention, the steam engine, and it reshaped everything and how we work around the world. Any project can make that spark and that ripple and could have a transformative change for our globe in a good way if we can just figure out what is our steam engine and how do we encourage those ripples throughout. That, I know that seems really big, and I'm not asking you guys to become the manufacturers of the next steam engine, but if we can apply some thinking to how we design projects, we can create an enabling pathway that if we stumble across the next steam engine, it is able to ripple out. So why is this different approach needed? Well, I think I'm kind of, speaking to the converted here, but the IPBES report outlines that we are simply not on track to meet our biodiversity, sustainability, and climate change goals internationally. And they identified a few key reasons for this. Firstly, we have a disorganization of knowledge and capacity globally. Great work exists, but it isn't being shared, and where potential exists, it isn't being scaled, and it isn't widely known about, often because of failings from another element, which is this short-term cycles that we're trapped in that aren't suitable for the spaces that we work. So often our outcomes and our projects are designed around financial or political cycles, which have nothing to do with the ecological or the, entirely complex community time cycles that we actually need to be working with if we expect long-term sustainable change. And as a result, we end up with this piecemeal project approach that's reactive and fragmented and not coordinated and doesn't have that long-term mentality to it. Instead, we sacrifice long-term outcomes for short-term reportables to keep our funders happy. And that is just an inefficient use of the funding and the labour and the knowledge that already is going into addressing the issue. So I have an example for you that, if it's still feeling quite intangible. We all spend quite a lot of time pulling weeds, yeah? So a simple transformative approach to this problem would be to pause and say, where are these weeds coming from? If we think about it at a catchment scale, maybe we instead start at the top and we're working on a riparian weed. Maybe we apply a top-down approach in our catchment. If we're working on roadside high disturbance weeds, maybe we partner with council or Transport New South Wales to apply some kind of, quarantine process. If we are working with annuals, maybe we apply a successional canopy restoration techniques. Now, there are probably tens or thousands of reasons that just jumped into your head as to why those different solutions won't work. And that's great. Those are the starting points of recognizing how we are currently trapped within systems that can be redesigned. Those kinds of barriers, they're not problems for me. They're instead actually demonstrating your expertise in your landscape, in your community, in the systems that you work in, and they're opportunities to be considered within the redesign of these systems that we're operating within. However, this approach, it does require us to be brave and to be ambitious, and it can seem really overwhelming. So I'm going to try today to give small scale starting ideas wherever possible. So how does this happen? Well, the first way that it happens is broad thinking, that bravery. We need to start asking what is causing this instead of how do we treat this. We need to turn the issue off at the source so that our treatment can actually reach an end. The common example that we give here is in marine debris. We want to turn the plastic waste off at the source. That, of course, is a global issue, but it can be done on a local level. Say, for example, you're doing a marine debris cleanup. Well, you might go the extra step and categorize each of the different types of waste that you find, and you might even submit that data to the Australian Marine Debris Database. But at that point, you're assuming that they're going to do something with the data. How about instead, after you've categorized that waste, you identify what that waste is and where the local sources within your area might be. And then you could take that data and you could partner with those people or those organizations that are creating that source of waste. And maybe you could apply some local pilot options to reduce it locally and then communicate that approach to allow it to be scaled. If you're doing a cleanup and you're finding a lot of snack packets and you notice that there's a school nearby, partnering with that school to reframe how they go about, the meals that they provide or that kids bring into the school could go a long way. And you're going to be backed by the data of the cleanup that you did in the first place. Another way that another element that we need to build into this is collaboration. So when we increase this broad scope, we are requiring broad skills. We do not expect you to be, and you simply can't be, an expert in the range that the multiple silos that you need to work across for a transformative project. Now, a really big international, fantastic example of how far this can reach is the Blue Ventures model in Madagascar. So in Madagascar, there were some nearshore reefs that were being overfished, and through some investigation, it was found that it's because the subsistence fishers couldn't go far to get the fish because they had too many mouths to feed at home. They had too many kids, and they just needed to be away for a minimal amount of time to get maximum amount of food to come home and feed their family. Talking with the community, they found that this wasn't by choice. This was by a matter of circumstance. So marine ecologists went and partnered with health professionals and provided birth control to that community. And over a matter of years, the drop in birth rate meant that the demand for childcare on both parents was eased off enough that the subsistence fishermen could be allowed to go a little bit further. They could diversify their intensive fishing on those nearshore reefs and go a little further, which increased their catch. The community as a whole was so thankful that they engaged with the program more to be able to gain things like sustainable fisheries practice, but also educating the kids. And this because the scope was so broad, there were so many opportunities for intervention to the other elements that they were experiencing. That's a really big example, but it is a great example of how really out-of-the-box collaborations were required to make significant changes. The other huge thing that we need to do if we're going to think about transformative change is that we need to simply stop accepting barriers. Barriers that are implemented by systems have been designed that way, which means they can be redesigned. And that's where I say we've got to be a little bit brave. And we've also got to understand our power, right? So these barriers could be financial, political, capacity, or cultural. If we're talking about a financial barrier, I think one that we're all probably quite familiar with is that short-term funding cycle that doesn't align with ecological timescales. Why are we not pushing back on the funders that are implementing these? Now, I'm not saying that the time to push back is, when you've received a grant or when you're applying for a grant, but collectively, we are a really powerful network that actually has a lot of value to the funders, especially if they're government funders. So collectively, we could be using that to approach them outside of those funding cycles to outline why they simply aren't meeting the priorities of their own funding programs. We could also seek philanthropic funds. Now, we don't all know a millionaire, but there is a good chance that all of these philanthropic funders out there, they do live within communities, and they are often a lot more values driven and a lot more open to understanding the nuance and the requirements of a project. So if we can find them and if we can connect with them, they are probably, values-wise, probably really happy to support local projects. Another example of where I've seen people challenge this kind of financial limitation is community groups that have wanted to do 4 years worth of post-planting monitoring, but were only given the money for 18 months. So they fundraised to be able to co-fund that ongoing monitoring. And they did that not really out of, need to support the plants, but more to demonstrate to the funders that, look, if you gave the amount of the time and the funding required to do this long-term monitoring, look at the quality of the data that we're able to give. And compare that to the quality of the data that you got from all of your other projects that were only given 18 months. And they kind of did it as a bit of an example to the funder. Other ways that we can look at challenging these barriers are political. So if what you want to do is really creative and out of the box, but it's actually not allowed by, I don't know, the Biosecurity Act, can you apply for an exemption to run a project as a trial? Can you partner with the policymakers or the authority body like LLS to run a trial and see if it's worth challenging some of those limitations that policy puts on our ideas? A lot of the time, capacity and knowledge is a barrier for us, but we can seek those strategic partnerships that I spoke about earlier, and we could build in research into part of the project that we want to do so that we can gain the knowledge that we don't currently have and do it in a way that shares it with the peer-reviewed literature so we can actually contribute to that wider source of knowledge. And we can also train our team if that's one of our barriers, that we don't have that current capacity, but we want it and it's within, the mission of our organization. We could train our team to do that. And then finally, one of the biggest barriers that I think that we face is cultural. And to explore that, there's an example that I like to talk about the Lion Guardians program in Kenya. And I think in terms of predator management in Australia, whilst the cultures are very, very different, there's a lot to be learnt from this program and how it integrated cultural practice with approach to predators and livestock. So just quickly, basically in certain tribes in Kenya, for the boys to become men, the rite of passage was to go out and to kill a lion. And obviously with modern conservation concerns, that was becoming less and less, suitable. But at the same time, lions take livestock, which threaten the livelihoods of farmers in these communities. So this organization worked with the groups to kind of reframe this cultural practice and reframed the idea of, instead of killing a lion being a token of masculinity, now it's about the bravery and the honor of the protection of these lions. These boys adopt a lion and they look after them, they protect them from poaching, but they also take ownership. If a lion takes a livestock from a farmer, they reimburse that farmer for the livestock in part of recognition of the value that that lion plays in that ecosystem and as an adoption of kin. Now, it seems really out of the box, but I think if we were to explore predator management in Australian landscapes, culture is a big part of our barriers in exploring our options in that space. And I think we might have a lot to learn from that example. Now, this, again, feels really big. And I know Landcare's value is in local people acting locally. And that's not to say we don't do that, but it's to say, why don't we act locally, but design for trajectory or replication? To do this, we might get a little bit better at documenting not just our outcomes, but also our process. We might get better at evaluating. Maybe we hire an external evaluator to understand how we did it. And getting better at sharing. And sharing doesn't just mean writing our reports. It means getting creative about what our reportable documents are. How can we make them more shareable, more digestible? It also means that while we're documenting this process, if we want it to be scalable, maybe we identify which parts of our process were designed for very specific local contexts, and that will allow future people trying to replicate it to identify, well, that was done for this community. What would that element look like where we want to implement it? So just those considerations whilst you're creating your documentation can allow it to be more easily replicated in the future. So how do we achieve that? Well, one of the key elements to understanding what transformational change would look like for the different issues or locations that you're looking at is by utilizing systems thinking and identifying your leverage points. So I really like this analogy for what systems thinking is. And basically we've got different people poking at different parts of the elephant saying, an elephant is like a rope. An elephant is moist and mushy. An elephant looks like a trunk. It looks like a tree. An elephant looks like a snake. Yeah. If we're fixating on different parts of the system, we're misunderstanding the whole system. So that's what system thinking tries to achieve. It tries to be a different way of looking at the bigger picture to see how problems are interconnected and where we can intervene to create the most change. It identifies, in doing that, we identify the source of a symptom, but it also identifies where all of these different silos of society begin to interact. We can look at different scales of systems or different types of systems. So social, ecological, supply chains, food, but we also, when we start to map out our own system that we're working within, we do start to identify where they're interacting. And by doing so, we can identify where certain key points of intervention might be. How do we do this? Well, it really does. There's a lot of tools, and at the end, I will share with you quite a few of these tools. But it really does require just a big old butcher's paper and mind mapping and a whole bunch of stakeholders around a table. Because, like I said, you as one person or you as one organization cannot be expected to understand a whole system, especially when we start to build in these different elements of the system and interacting silos. So we map it out. We identify the inputs, who the key actors are, what are the drivers, what are the barriers. In the process of mapping it out, we start to identify leverage points. And these leverage points are where a small strategic intervention can lead to a big change. Think about it like where the steam engine can change the whole system, where the ripples can come out from. When we've mapped it out, we've got that big old mess in front of us. We're looking for things like feedback loops, right? Are they positive or negative feedback loops? We're looking for what are the different partners involved in this system and what capacity do they have to either reinforcing or removing the barriers that we're facing. We're also looking for opportunities for advocacy for change, and that often can be one of the biggest roles that people can play. There's a lot of work, and it's linked at the end. It's explored in the iceberg model and in Dr. Diane Modell, sorry, I can't remember her last name, has done a lot of work on the hierarchy of these leverage points. And she's identified that the most significant leverage points are the leverage points that can change public opinion. So whilst we often maybe dismiss advocacy, it is identified as being one of, if it can be done in a strategic or a effective way, it is one of the most important leverage points that we can identify within our system. Okay, so how do we design for transformative change? So we've done all of the work of understanding our problem. We've identified the source and the symptom that we were addressing and how we can work to address the source. We've also mapped out our whole system and we know all the players and we've identified our leverage points. How do we design a project that has transformative potential? So the IPBES report identifies 5 key elements. We want to design for long-term impact. And this means that projects need to have a life past our grant period. This requires adequate funding to establish those really strong foundations to start with. We need strong networks, which means we need strong engagement. We need strong community ownership over a project, capacity, and also the knowledge. Community ownership here is really the most certain way that we can deliver that, post-grant life delivery. But there are other ways, and that's where, this is a really new emerging field, especially in Australia. It hasn't been applied extensively. And I encourage you to get creative about how you can ensure post-grant life legacy to the funding and have long-term impacts. Projects also need to be transformative, obviously. They need to be a little bit different. What makes the project that you're developing different from the previous attempts to address this? If your project that you're putting in isn't different from previous attempts, then we need to look at the previous attempts and understand why they didn't scale. Because if they were perfect and they didn't need to be changed in any way, then the problem is in communicating those results and scaling them. And maybe that's where we need to focus our efforts on more. So we can also ask why, if it is different, why hasn't it been done before? What needs to change to make it happen? You're identifying those barriers and how we're going to overcome them. One of the key things for this is going to be collaboration. And now we don't just want that collaboration to be transactional. That's really important. We want to make sure that we're building shared ownership of a project, particularly if one of the great things that collaboration can help us achieve is that long-term impact if we need ongoing monitoring or ongoing supervision of a project. And we could bring in councils or statutory agencies that will exist and have paid staff post-grant life to help run those elements. But it also builds in resilience and a shared value and a shared commitment across whatever scale we're working on, be that catchment, council, state. We want to bring in that collaboration so that we have that shared ownership and we start to work across those different silos that we spoke about. That also means that we're including more expertise into our networks. So the fourth key element is scalability and influence. So when we're done, can others use our model? Can your resources that you're developing through this process be developed at a scale that is applicable to regional or state scale, not just local? And the documenting and the reports that you're creating from doing this work, who's going to read them? Other than your funder, who is going to read them? Can we redesign our project so that our deliverables, instead of just a final report, is something that is more useful, allows scalability? Can we write a systems manual on how you developed it? Can you write an analysis, an evaluation on how you did your community engagement to encourage collective ownership? Sharing, your systems, your management, your technical learnings, rather than just your outputs, means that your methodology has scalability. And then finally, a key element is equity and inclusion. So who benefits, and are all of those groups that benefit involved? One of my key, I'm going to die on this hill, is that everything in life, whether we're talking about chemistry, cooking, natural resource management, every element of life, is the diversity of the inputs determines the complexity of the outputs. Now, if we're working in a space where we're looking for this complex of an output in terms of changing a whole system, we really need to be making sure that our inputs are as diverse as they possibly can be to be representative of the whole system that we're trying to work with. So key ways to achieve this is intergenerational and intercultural knowledge transfer, different ways of knowing, and appreciation and inclusion of different ways of knowing is a key element that's been underappreciated and underutilized in transformational change in the past. In Australia, we should be asking, are traditional owners, young people, or underrepresented groups part of it? These aren't just a nice to have. They're a really key function in making sure that we have robust and sustainable and replicatable projects that have co-ownership and have sustainable outcomes. Sorry, Oh, there we go. All right. So they are the kinds of questions that I encourage you to be thinking on when you're looking at designing your project. Now, in reality, what does that look like? That looks like a lot more time and collaboration put into the design phase than you might be used to. So I do a lot of grant writing and project management workshops with communities, groups around New South Wales. And a lot of those groups are often surprised by how much of those workshops are spent on project design rather than grant writing. But 80% of the success of a grant is done in the design phase. So a lot of the failings that we might be experiencing in our grant writing applications, and this isn't just my opinion, this comes from talking with funders, is that it's clearly evident to funders when projects have been written as a reaction to a grant opportunity. And sometimes they do get through, but a lot of the time they are looking for projects that have a lot more robust planning and collaboration being put into the design of it, which means that we need to be designing projects long before we've identified our funding opportunity. We need to be, as a core part of our practice and addressing our missions of each of our different organizations, coming together to understand, to do all of that systems thinking, to go, well, if that's our goal, what's the system that we're working in? What's the change that we're looking for? How do we address that? And developing up these really robust shelf projects that are ready and waiting for us to come across the right grant opportunity. So what are the common pitfalls that grant and funders tell me about when they are assessing grant applications? Often, project applications are limited because they are seen to be manageable in their scope to a local application. Now, that's not to say that's a bad thing. That's where Landcare thrives, in local people doing local things with local landscapes. But can the scope be changed in a way where it is replicable for other landscapes? Can your project be seen as a local pilot instead of just a local project? Another element where the project's applications can often fall down is they can become too focused on the output rather than the outcome. So a little refresher for anyone who, like me, gets tongue-tied around those two. Outputs are the direct, immediate, long-term result, the direct and immediate term results of your project. So your output is how many trees you planted. Yeah. Your outcomes are the change that's likely to occur at the end of the project as a result of your work. So that is increasing habitat connectivity, right? So a lot of the time, submissions are made far too focused on how many trees you're going to plant. I'm going to do this. I'm going to run this many events. Look how hard I'm going to work to earn this money, rather than this is the solution to this problem that we're working collectively to address. They often don't provide a clear link between the two either, or bigger strategies that they're working within. Funders also say that it's very clear to them where there's no funder alignment. So that's where they've gone, oh, there's a funding opportunity, it's asking for this much money, I'm going to put in this grant application, rather than taking the time to, I often talk about the Goldilocks funder. So who is the funder where you get the overlap of, in a Venn diagram of your organization's mission statement, the mission of your project, and the mission of the funding, and waiting till you get the funder who fits within that Venn diagram, rather than just applying to everything that comes out and having a scattergun approach. It is quite evident to funders, and it's not what they're looking for, especially in this transition that we're slowly, not as strategically as I would like to see it, but we are slowly seeing a shift towards outcome-based funding. Outcome-based funding. So they are looking for that more strategic alignment. They also say that the funding has no plan for long-term learning or legacy, and that is not a criticism of the people putting the application in, it's a criticism of the way that the funding opportunities have been designed. But outlining that, maybe you say in your application, the time period for this funding is not adequate in order to achieve the monitoring required to understand the outcome of this project. However, as such, we are submitting this project as phase 1, where phase 2 will provide X, Y, and Z. So you're outlining the plan for that long term, even though you're recognizing the limitation within the current opportunity. And then finally, community groups are overly conservative across the board in their funding requests. They often see funding as the funder is doing them the favor by giving them the money. And I'd really like to encourage you to actually see it as the inverse, particularly where your funder is a government organisation. Funding is grant opportunities, especially where it's a government, is actually a government outsourcing the work that they need to do to community groups for a whole bunch of reasons. One of which is because you've got local community ownership and investment in the project, so you will get better outcomes. So recognizing your value, ask for what you actually need in order to achieve the projects. Projects are not, the grant funders that I speak to tell me time and time again that you are not more likely to be successful because you asked for less money. This isn't a request for quote that a council has put out for weed management. These are grant applications that should be showing a robust, logical, and well thought out budget rather than the cheapest possible budget. So if you need specific things in order to achieve long-term outcomes, like supporting an honours student to do the research, to share your learnings with the peer-reviewed literature, then put that in as an item, include it. So those are the common pitfalls that we see in grant writing. So instead of doing it that way, let's state what we're doing and then say, well, here's the deeper issue that we're actually trying to address, and outline how it identifies within the system. So grant writing, I like to see them as a bit of a story, and much like you might do if you cast your mind back to university days and you're writing your introduction, start broad, right? Define the systemic problem that you are trying to address, and then describe the local context that you're going to develop as a pilot. So you're going to demonstrate how this solution is going to work in your community, but it is addressing this systemic problem. You want to also describe your local lever and your unique approach. So why has this never been done before, and how are you going to address it, right? In this, it also means that there's a huge amount of risk that you might have to address because you're doing something that's never been done before, and risk management is a key part of all grant applications. And something that people are often shocked when I tell them is that there are too many well-managed risks is not a bad thing. You can have 30 risks in your risk management matrix. As long as they are all managed well, that is not a bad thing. That is a demonstration of a robust project. So don't be afraid to outline them and demonstrate that you've thought them through and you're going to manage them. You also want to demonstrate your local network's collaborative capacity across the scope of your project. What I mean by this is the network that you've established to deliver this project of all these different stakeholders across the broader scope than you're used to working within. How have they bringing the capacity to manage the different elements? So maybe you've partnered with the Red Cross to bring mental health expertise, or maybe you're partnering with a local ag retailer to help address a waste issue. You want to outline who your partners are and what their role will be, and demonstrate that you have got the whole scope of the system that you're talking about covered. We also want to be aligning with bigger priorities, strategies, and plans. Now, I know this seems counterintuitive because I've just spent the last half an hour telling you that the systems are all broken and they're not ambitious enough, but there will be a plan or a strategy that does align. If all else fails, refer to the IPBES strategy that I've linked at the bottom of this, which was a global assessment of the progress of transformative change across the world. And it outlines very clearly how ambitious we need to be with projects. So identifying how your strategy or your approach aligns with bigger priorities, be they council, state, federal, international, demonstrates that you are working towards these bigger goals and you have that longer legacy thinking and broader scope thinking to your application. And you want to outline this legacy. So you want to make it very, very, very clear how you're going to, what learning you're going to take from this. You know, we're not just doing things, we're not just if we're not just treating symptoms, if we're treating the source, then we are going to learn from that practice. We probably aren't going to turn things off at the source our first turn, right? So we're learning throughout that process. So how are we going to document our learning? How are we going to increase our influence? How are we going to share that knowledge widely? And how are we going to demonstrate the potential of this trial to be replicated in other places? And to do all of this, you need to fund it sufficiently. You need to be confidently asking for enough money to do all of this. Maybe this means budget lines for videographers to make engaging content to get people's attention. Maybe this means funding research partnerships, which are very expensive if you haven't gone down that route before. Maybe this means putting in some conference attendance fees and putting on our big brave pants and presenting at conferences ourselves. You know, that's not just for academics, that's for us as professionals in the industry to share our learnings in those spaces. We want to make those outputs useful beyond just our funders reading our final reports. We want to make them accessible for newsletters and social media and online toolkits, and even better if they can be relevant at a different scale to just what you've delivered locally. So I really want to encourage you there to really ask for what is required to deliver a transformative project rather than trying to undersell and undercut yourself. Okay, so I'm doing so much better on time than I thought I was going to, so that's excellent. Here are some links to some tools that you can use to start to kind of do that project design part of this project, of this kind of new way of approaching a project. So the iceberg model looks at you mapping the event or the symptom all the way through to the source of the issue and the underlying enabling factors that we're addressing. The leverage points mapping does a similar thing. And then you identify those key points of influence throughout your system. So essentially a leverage point mapping is after you've done your big systems mapping exercise, you can go through and identify those points of influence, or it can be done alongside the iceberg model if that's your preferred methodology. An outcome hierarchy helps to prioritize what matters the most in your outcomes, and it's good for clarifying your goals versus your nice to haves. A theory of change. Now, if you're sort of interested in what I'm saying, but a lot of it kind of seems too much for you, or you don't want to do a lot of reading, theory of change is where I would start. If you're interested in diving a little bit deeper, going into this is kind of a nice little way to dip your feet into this idea of strategic project design. And it helps to link your activities to your outcomes and make sure that you are doing the assumptions that you have that doing this will lead to this actually do make sense once you break it all down. It can be really simple. There can be, you know, one-page templates that just ask you to put your activities and your outcomes into a one page, or it can be a really detailed 7-point process. Depends on how useful you find it, what your capacity is, how engaged your group is, but at least working on that one-page template can be a really helpful place to start in testing the assumptions of your current projects. And then the IPBES report that I have referred to throughout, at the very end of its summary for policymakers, it has a 2-page kind of question cards that is a set of reflective questions that you can use to guide your project design and help you think about other things that you might want to consider in your project design. It does, however, refer back to the report quite a bit, so it can be quite a bit of reading if you want to go into depth, but I really do encourage you to explore these and these tools, they can feel quite overwhelming. Dip your feet in as much as you want. Like I said, theory of change is a great place to start. But all of them, they're just asking you to kind of pause, reflect, and sharpen the way that you're designing and telling the story of your project. And they'll improve you in identifying those different levers of change, and the maybe small little refines to the scope that you're working in can really increase the potential of your project. And so you've got more information on this slide, and Olivia will send you my slides at the end. The first one is that report that I've referred to throughout. It is a 50-page summary for policymakers. They have just released the chapters, but the 50-page report is dense enough. So I suggest you start with the executive summary and then move more throughout if you are more interested. And then the second one is a webinar that I recently hosted on applying systems thinking for transformational change in conservation. And it's available on YouTube that you are free to watch if you're interested in some more examples about how this kind of thinking has been actually applied across the world. And finally, before we jump into the questions, I'd just really like to leave you with my favorite saying, which is, above all, be creative. And remember, there's no red tape in Landcare. It's all just pink elastic. So I really think that Landcare is one of the most powerful places that we can be pushing these boundaries and removing these barriers and running these trials and trying to make meaningful change. These are my contact details. Like I said, Olivia is going to send out the slides, so please feel free to get in touch if I can provide any more context to anything I've discussed today, or if there's an element that you think I can work with your group on, I'm more than happy to explore. I am listed on the Shared Services Hub, so that is an option. But I'd love to open up the floor to questions. Just stop sharing. Hello. I think, are there questions in the chat?
There's no questions as yet in the chat, but if people would like to just pop their hands up, I think we've got one now from Danielle.
Yeah, it's from Chris, who's also.
And Chris, yep.
Yes, really illuminating. Can you give us a quick example of the points that you've made in this presentation with a specific case study that you might have, just a quick run through so we can see the some examples in action from, say, a grant application?
Yeah, of course. So like I said, there are no examples for done because we don't live in a just and sustainable world. There are transformative projects that have transformative potential. And those are, we don't have HEAP in Australia. So I've actually just submitted a Churchill Fellowship application to go overseas and study these projects around the world where it has been done, because it's just not, it's being applied in overseas communities more than it's being applied in Australia. But one of the projects that is the most interesting to me, and I think is probably the most relevant to modern Australian communities, but had amazing ambition and has been really successful, was in the west coast of America. There were farming communities that were noticing a degradation of their water quality, and they were losing riparian zones, and they were really unstable environments. These rivers were highly managed with dams for hydroelectricity. And the First Nations communities were really concerned about the health of these waterways and what that was how that was reflecting in their cultural knowledge. So community groups ultimately knew what needed to happen. You know, if there was going to be, if we were going to restore all of these issues that they were seeing, they needed to do something really big and brave that nobody wanted to talk about, which was, well, we have to remove the hydroelectrical dams, don't we? Like we can't, there are very few workarounds that will actually provide transformational change. Anything other than removing the dams is just going to be a band-aid. Now, that's a huge thing to consider financially, politically, industry, power supply, you know. So they didn't start there. They started with research. They started with a thorough assessment, and this was run by a partnership between a rainforest conservation group and Indigenous owners of an area. And they started with research of doing, you know, small community groups going, you know what, we're actually going to fund a literature review across the world of where band-aid solutions, you know, fish trap highways, things like that, have been applied, and have any of them actually led to progress, like significant improvement. And once they did that assessment, and they did that assessment on a global scale, but applied all of their learnings to a local capacity, as in, would this be relevant here? What would happen if we did it here? They found that they were able to really strongly demonstrate that no, there is no other solution. And earlier this year, the last hydroelectric dam, this happened 10 years ago. Earlier this year, the last hydroelectric dam was removed from these waterways as a result of those groups getting together and understanding the scope at which they were working towards and going, if we're going to go there, we need to lay the foundations here. And over time, as they demonstrated the importance of what they were doing, that they'd done all of their robust research, people just started coming along and joining, and they were very gentle. They were very supportive of people who were going to lose jobs, have electricity, you know, disruption. A just and sustainable future is a key element for any of these projects. So working with those people who were going to be impacted was a key part along the way. But they have just removed the last dam. So now starts the 20-30 year monitoring program of understanding how these waterways start to respond once, you know, salmon are able to flow again, things like that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, so they really put the effort into the initial groundwork to get everything organised and sorted.
Yeah, definitely. And that's going to be a theme across every project that is successful in this way. Like I said, even if we're talking really small scale, local catchment scale projects, the work that goes into the project design is going to be the determining factor as to whether it's funded. People are willing to, you know, do the brave, scary work of challenging these barriers with you. You need to be able to demonstrate that you've done your homework in that way.
Thank you very much.
We've just got a few questions in the chat, Jess. So we've got the first one from Angela from Greater Sydney. So, hey, Jess, do you have any recommendations for how to pitch phase 2 of a project to make it appealing to a funder? It seems that a lot of grants explicitly exclude support for existing projects.
Yeah, so that's where you've got to demonstrate that you're doing something different. They are excluding existing projects that are currently being done. So in your early design phase, when you know you're going to need phase 1 and you're going to need phase 2, save something for phase 2. You know, maybe your first phase is your groundwork and your second phase is about community education, but you're going to go, well, how about we do some research and we understand in phase 2, we're going to partner with a research partner and we're going to understand what is the most effective way of community engagement in this specific context. And we're going to use the work done in phase 1 as the example of that community engagement, community education that we're trying to communicate. But we're actually doing something different because in phase 2, we're looking at community engagement. Oh, whoops, we also need $15,000 for watering at the same time. So we'll just put that in as a separate line. But the focus of that project is community education. So thinking early on about how you can make it a little bit different, how you can have different priorities, and then just sneak in that line item that you do need. Very few funders will say no because there's a $15,000 line item for watering. When, especially if you can say, oh, we're going to bring the kids along to water them, is that an element of our research? Can one of our variables be, are people more engaged if they hold the watering can? You know, so just get creative. It would be my advice there.
We've also got a comment and a question from Camilla, also from Greater Sydney. Perhaps all that stuff going on with abalone divers switching to sea urchins to help save the kelp forest, which has been a collaboration with Australian chefs and seafood industry as an example.
Yeah, that is a fantastic example. Yeah, and the work that the Surfers for Climate's doing in communicating that out to the community is really, really powerful. So if anyone hasn't seen it, I encourage you. I think the documentary is called White Rock, and it's a really great local example. Thank you.
And then we've got from Larry around your tools and resources, just around, do you have a reference for systems thinking? What text or papers would you include?
Yeah, thanks for that. I can update my slides before I send them out to make sure that I do include something on systems thinking. I find systems thinking very, the thinkers on systems thinking love talking and they love explaining in depth how complicated it is, which means finding something shareable and accessible for community groups is quite hard. So I tend to jump over systems thinking and go to that leverage point thinking, because I think you guys know how to do a mind map, but I will definitely include something in there. There's a set of slides that I stole the elephant diagram from that's probably quite useful. I think it's talking about waste management in Thailand, but the theory is still quite useful. So I'll make sure that there's something included in the slides before I send them out.
Thanks, Jess. Does anyone else have any questions or comments that they would like to ask Jess or talk about?
I was just going to ask if you wouldn't mind just including something in leverage point thinking as well, if you're putting something on systems thinking in there.
Yeah, so there is something on leverage point mapping in there at the moment, but I can double check and make sure that I'll see if there's just a few other things that I can add in there.
Awesome, thank you.
Then we've got a question from Mel.
Hi, Jess. Thanks so much. I was actually writing a proposal as you were doing that because I've got a deadline and I'm really trying to stay on top of it. So just your conversation and everything you were saying just made sense and helped me to go, oh, yeah, that's right. So I'm working on community conservation conversation camps. I've been banging on about camps since I came to Landcare a year ago. So I'm very excited about this, and I'm hoping it's a delivery platform where we're actually gathering in nature to have conversations with all of our stakeholders. And that's the bottom line. So I'm calling from Wilyakarli country in the far west of New South Wales. So yeah, 40% of the state. So we need a way of engaging people, which is probably different to most other regions, and we need to round people up. So we either need to go and attend gymkhanas and shows and camp drafts, or we need to put on some fantastic events. And thankfully our local national park has offered us to use national parks as a venue. So yeah, that's kind of our project, and I'm hoping that we've got BCT trialling, funding the trial for this. So I'm hoping this is something that we can have a bigger picture conversation about across Landcare in the future, just to get people out in nature rather than in boardrooms on PowerPoints. But thank you so much for contributing to my work today. I appreciate it.
No worries at all. And it sounds like a really great project. Yeah, whenever I'm talking to community groups about acknowledging the value that Landcare has, I think that that's one of the key things is we think that the value that we have is in the number of on-ground actions that we do, and I wholeheartedly disagree. I think our connection to community, the social capital that we have, and the engagement we have with people is by far our strongest tool. And if we want to retain that, we've got to make it fun. People don't want to sit in a boardroom and they don't, they don't want to go to, shoot myself in the foot here, they don't want to come online and have these really complex, nuanced conversations. They want to go and have, fun camps and stuff like that. So that sounds like a fantastic project.
We've also got a question from Peter Piggott. So what are the particular practices you have noticed that support a good groundwork phase and good collaboration?
Yeah, so I mean, you'll get sick of me saying this eventually, but project planning. Starting to develop a project way before you've identified your funding, and approaching your funders really early. So when I do my project planning and grant writing workshop for groups, we step through how to develop a really strong, what I call a concept note. And that is basically outlines what you want to do. And you do that whenever. And you develop it up to a point that you can send it to your dream partners. And I write mine like a little bit of a letter. And down the bottom, it has a request and it says, we really see that you would bring X, Y, and Z value to this project. Maybe you're asking for money, but maybe you're just asking for expertise. Maybe you're asking for staff time. It doesn't matter what's included in that. But sending that to a partner really early gives them the opportunity, before you've identified your funding, gives them the opportunity to go, that's great, but you know what would make it even better? If we could also do this, it would help me achieve my goals if we could also do this and we can implement. And sending it to them in a way that really encourages that early collaboration is a really nice invitation for them to have co-ownership of a project. And I would send that, I wouldn't be shy with my concept note. I would send that to anyone I really want to be a partner with. And really, I don't believe that there's any such thing as too many collaborators or stakeholders on a project. I just think that there's poor facilitators, if that's ever a problem. So I would really encourage that. In terms of good groundwork phase, I'm not sure, do you mean groundwork as in background or actually on-ground deliverables? I think we all know how to do the good groundwork phase in terms of doing the actual on-ground work. That's kind of where our expertise probably is. But just making sure that it's well resourced would be a key element there. And push back on funders. If they say you only have 12 months of funding, don't plant trees that are going to die if they're not watered. Push back on them and say, no, I'm not going to do that, would be my advice there. I'm not sure, does that answer your question there, Peter?
Yeah. And the groundwork was referring to the creating the conditions for good collaboration. Like what are the, and you talked about it in your workshop design and that concept note, but yeah, just looking to understand more about those. Yeah, what creates the conditions for collaboration to flourish or partnerships to flourish?
Well, Peter, you've summed up my Churchill Fellowship application in one sentence. So if I get it, I'll come back to you with the answer of that in a year. But my suggestion, my really strong connected communities. So like I said, working on that, holding those camps, they will invest into future projects long time after they've happened. So really investing in those and also investing in your partnerships out of grant deliverables. Pick up the phone and call your old funders and update them on projects. If you're still watering trees that you planted 2 years ago whilst you're not being funded on doing it, call your funders and tell them that. They love that stuff, right? So nurture those relationships. You're most likely to get funded by previous funders than new funders. So nurture those relationships. Nurture your relationships with anyone who might be a potential funder or partner for you in the future, so that you're not this brand new person knocking on the door asking for a favor, but you have those trusted relationships where they'll trust you to be brave and be a bit more creative and push the boundaries a little bit.
Thank you, Jess. And thank you, Camilla, for popping that link to White Rock, the documentary that was mentioned in the chat. So if anyone wants to have a look at that, Camilla's just popped that into the chat for everyone to view. Do we have any further questions or comments for Jess? Oh, I don't think we do at this stage. So I'd just like to thank you, Jess, for coming in to do the webinar today. It was really informative and really interesting, and I think your approach is very much on exactly what Landcare requires as far as project management. So it resonates with many people across the state, I'm sure. So thank you very much for coming in. I will put the presentation and also the video of the recording together and put that up onto the shared services portal and gateway, and I will have a copy if anyone would like it. I can circulate that as well. So just got a comment from Peter.
I just wanted to say, Olivia, like just to, well, with this captive audience a little bit, is that some of the work that we're trying to do in the community of practice, which is about connecting the Landcare system, is leaning right into what Jess is talking about. So that we're working in complexity. The more a system can see about itself, the more capacity it has to then find wise action within its scope of interest and action. So participating in the different things that we're offering at a state scale and at regional scales to connect that system, build those partnerships, that exactly what Jess is saying about, like where the Murray Collective is a great example of this, of where a system is well connected, it meets regularly, they keep up to date, and when those funding applications come in, they already know what they want to put into it because they've been keeping in touch and talking to one another. So it's so yeah, just lean into those opportunities, as well as those your focus projects is also participating in the bigger scale things that just almost it's keeping connected for connection's sake, but we know enough about each other to then be able to see where the points of opportunity are and to take really good action into them. So thank you for letting me have a minute of your time to just offer that in.
Thank you, Peter. And Jess, did you want to have the final words, or did you have anything to say to wrap us up today?
No, I think I've covered it, and I would echo what Peter said. You guys are really leaving Landcare as a full-time job. Man, I miss the community of practice stuff that you guys did. It's just feeling like you're part of a big team working across the state is really powerful. So really appreciate it and lean in where you get the opportunity. And yeah, if you have any questions, please do get in touch. I'm more than happy to just, answer the phone, have a chat, and I'd love to work with your groups across the state if you think there's a place to work together.
Thanks, Jess. And Jess is also available on the Shared Services Hub portal. So if you'd like to approach Jess for any other particular work for your organisations, you can definitely do that as well. So thanks everyone for your time today. I hope you found it interesting and informative, and have a beautiful rest of the day. And thank you, Jess. All right, take care. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Jess. Thanks, everyone.